Invasive and introduced species have caused problems all over the world as humans have either deliberately or inadvertently carried species far from their original environments. Australia, whose environment was essentially isolated from the rest of the world by millennia, is a unique ecology that has been famously threatened by invasive species like the cane toad and the European rabbit. But one of the species that most threatened Australia is much less well known, and it's not an animal but a plant from North America, the prickly pear cactus. For a time, this poky plant threatened to unleash a pernicious pestilence, a pea green pandemonium, but a unique solution came along to prevent the Cactus Calamity. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Australia was first discovered and explored by Europeans in the 17th century, including voyages by Abel Tasman. The Dutch called the land New Holland, though they never established colonies there. It wasn't until after the American Revolution that the British seriously considered establishing a colony in Australia, largely in response to losing the American colonies as a way to deport criminals. Beginning in 1788, the British would send about 160,000 convicts to Australia instead. The first fleet, a fleet of 11 ships carrying over 1,500 people, arrived at Botany Bay on January 20th, 1788, although Captain Arthur Phillip, who led the fleet, would deem Botany Bay unsuitable, establishing a colony at Sydney Cove on January 26th. 775 of the colonists were deported convicts, while another 645 were free persons. By this time, Great Britain had some experience in establishing colonies and were familiar with the difficulties of establishing permanent settlements in unfamiliar lands. The ships carried supplies for two chief purposes: survival, which included building a shelter and establishing a food supply, and industry, in the hopes of making the colony profitable, a key piece of the economic concept of mercantilism, where the colony's primary purpose is to enrich the mother country. They brought a large variety of vegetables and grains, such as wheat, barley, cabbages, coffee, cocoa, cotton, sugar cane, rice, and potatoes, along with livestock like cattle, fowl, pigs, and sheep. Sir Joseph Banks, head of the Royal Society of London and a member of the Cook expedition which had visited Australia, likely suggested sending along another plant as well, one that might seem strange: the prickly pear cactus. It's not certain what kind of cactus was originally brought, although the National Museum of Australia suggests that they were likely Ampuntia monacantha, more commonly known as the drooping prickly pear, the cochineal prickly pear, or Barbary fig. This cactus was picked up in Rio de Janeiro during the long journey from England to Australia. The cactus was not brought for what the plant provided, but what it was infested with: cochineal insects from Brazil. Before synthetic dyes, cochineal insects were the best source for bright red dye. Native to the Americas, these insects had been crushed and used for dyes for at least centuries before the Spanish were introduced to it. The dye was incredibly valuable. It was the second most valuable export out of Spanish Mexico in the colonial period, behind only silver. It made the most brilliant dye for the reddish fabrics that adorned the wealthy and the royal. Roman cardinals wore red. Kings wore red. The British Army was known for its red coats. By sending the cactus to Australia, Banks and the British hoped to establish an industry to compete with the Spanish monopoly. Like many dreams of those planning a colony, the dye industry in New South Wales didn't take off. The insects didn't take to the climate, leaving only the cactuses, essentially useless. The drooping prickly pear is still found in coastal regions of New South Wales and considered a weed, but it didn't spread far from the areas where it was introduced. In the decades that followed, however, more species of cactus were brought to Australia. Prickly pear cacti do offer some other possible uses. Early settlers used the plant to create natural hedges, which would keep out wild animals and relatively little investment. And the plant's natural drought resistance made it a potential source of livestock feed in times of scarcity. It was even planted as an ornamental plant in gardens. Unfortunately, the cactus was well suited to the dry conditions of the Australian interior. They were certainly being cultivated at Parramatta before 1840 and were in Chinchilla in Queensland by 1843. There were a variety of species, but the most prominent would be the Opuntia inermis and the Opuntia stricta, called the common pest pear and the spiny pest pear in Australia. A variety of conditions led to the cactus proliferating. There are two primary means of dispersal. The various species can be established via seeds or by loose plant segments. The cactus seeds are coated and tough, allowing them to be eaten by animals and birds and spread through their feces. While native animals did not kill the plant, the fruit of the prickly pears was eaten by all kinds of animals, including crows, magpies, and emus, as well as livestock. Plant segments could also be responsible for large dispersal in floods or high winds. The Great Flood of 1893, also called the Black February Flood, that hit Brisbane, actually a series of floods as the Brisbane River burst its banks 3 times that month, may particularly have contributed to the spread, along with less serious floods. Prior to the 1870s, the plant was generally considered somewhat useful, but soon the spread was causing some to sound the alarm. In 1872, a petition was presented to Parliament calling for a ban on using the plant as a hedge, even as others were advocating for increased use. The plant grew rapidly and ruined agricultural land, taking over millions of acres with out-of-control growth. Nothing in Australia ate the plants themselves, leaving them undisturbed as they spread. In 1886, the government in New South Wales passed the Prickly Pear Destruction Bill, which established inspectors whose job was to identify cactus infestations. If on Crown land, they were to be immediately destroyed, while private landowners were required to destroy the cactus or face fines. The act also made it illegal to cultivate prickly pear cactus. Queensland acted slightly later, with part of the Crown Lands Bill offering some incentives for landowners to destroy the cactus. Debate during the bill showed that there was concern over the plant. One member complained that land purchased by the government was half covered with prickly pear, and the government shall not take it over until it is cleared off. When the Secretary for Lands insisted the infestation was small and nearly cleared, the member complained, "We all know that land cannot be cleared of prickly pear in a month or two, and that even after destruction, the roots and seeds will still be there." The exchange illustrates one of the most difficult problems of the infestation. The cacti were remarkably resilient to destruction. The primary methods were fire and mechanical. Mechanical destruction means digging up and destroying the plant, but the cacti are difficult to completely destroy, with stubborn root systems and pads that can easily regenerate unless totally destroyed. Fire was also not as effective as you might think. Extremely moisture-dense cacti do not burn easily, and even when burned, individual pads and roots can still survive. Poisoning could be more effective, but no means proved effective at halting the spread. In 1887, Forest Ranger T.H.B. McGee wrote a report advising further action against the cactus. He reported that prickly pear is growing in abundance in Queensland, near to and along the boundaries dividing New South Wales. He advised that Queensland should establish a Destruction Act as well. Multiple other reports were sent to the Queensland government, with the Undersecretary of Agriculture writing that legislative action should be taken, that this noxious weed may be exterminated. In New South Wales, a new bill, substantially the same as the 1886 bill, was passed in 1901 regarding eliminating the prickly pear pest. The same year, Queensland offered a £5,000 reward for anyone who could propose an effective means of eradication, which they doubled in 1907. In 1902, the Sunday Morning Herald reported that the depreciation of property in certain districts have already reached 50% due to the pest. According to the Queensland State Archives, suggestions came from around the world and included salt, prairie cattle, steamrollers, arsenic, electricity, and a machine that used mirrors to focus the sun rays to burn the prickly pear. A wild later suggestion was to use mustard gas to kill the wildlife spreading the plant. During and after World War I, more suggestions came to mind. One suggested using liquid fire, like that used by German flamethrowers. Another suggested adapting war tanks for the purpose. None proved effective. By 1900, more than 10 million acres of land were infested, driving farmers off their land. By 1920, that had increased to 58 million acres, an area nearly as large as the modern United Kingdom, with estimates that the plant was spreading 2.4 million acres a year. A report in 1913 by W.B. Alexander of the Advisory Council of Science and Industry described the scale of the problem. No part of the world has ever, or even now, possesses such a soil affliction to contend against as this state has in that most terrible and appalling gigantic octopus, prickly pear. Alexander wrote that the plant had possession of fully 30 million acres of settlement lands. If not stopped, then this great state's closer settlement lands, practically as a whole, will be doomed. In 1912, the Queensland government established an experimental station on the advice of the Queensland Board of Advice on prickly pear destruction, deep in the afflicted lands at Dulacca, under the direction of a full-time scientist. That scientist was a bit of a marvel herself. Dr. Jean White was only the second woman in Australia to earn a doctorate of science, and it was the first time a woman had ever been appointed to a scientific position by the Australian government. She researched means of controlling the spreading cactus, eventually finding some successes with the use of cochineal insects against one species of cactus. She remained in charge until 1916, when World War I made it impossible to find staff or chemicals for continued research. As she later described the situation, there were areas where you could not have walked except on top of the pear. While she didn't identify a permanent solution, the work was promising enough to encourage a further research into biological controls using insects as a solution. As early as 1914, a Queensland prickly pear traveling commission had recommended bringing in insects or plant diseases from the cacti's native home in the Americas. In 1919, the New South Wales and Queensland governments came together with the Commonwealth government to find a solution. Destroying the pear by conventional methods was proving too expensive, but campaigns were waged to destroy them via poison. By 1926, the Queensland Prickly Pear Land Commission reported that 31,000 tins of arsenic pentoxide and 27,000 tins of Robert's Improved Pear Poison, which was arsenic pentoxide mixed with sulfuric acid, had been sold, to, unfortunately, little effect in terms of slowing the plant's advance. Tens of thousands of birds, emus, crows, and magpies were killed via a bounty system to try to prevent spread. In 1924, despite the efforts already made, politicians in New South Wales were ignorant enough of the issue that 27 politicians were taken on a train trip to see the extent of the devastation in rural districts. This seemed to have spurred the creation of the 1924 Prickly Pear Act and the New South Wales Prickly Pear Destruction Commission. Ultimately, the board determined that mechanical or chemical treatment is of little real value in dealing with the pest. Among the board's first actions was to send a team of entomologists and scientists under Alan P. Dobb to identify and collect new biological agents. Simultaneously, research stations were established that would test over 30 species of insects in controlled environments. In order to avoid an old woman who swallowed the fly scenario, they hoped to find an insect that would devastate cactus populations without destroying Australia's more economic crops. Experimental stations in the United States would remain for 12 years, with several stations in both Mexico and Argentina as well. They documented 150 different species of insects that ate prickly pear and other cactus. Ultimately, about a third of those were sent to Australia, with some 500,000 individual insects making the cross-Pacific journey. According to Dodd, the initial plan was to establish an insect complex of several or many species, but ultimately a single species proved to be the most effective means of biological containment. Cactoblastis cactorum, commonly called the cactus moth, is native to South America, where its larvae feed extensively on prickly pear cactus. The cactus moth, first established in Australia in 1925, astonished the researchers. The initial consignment of eggs, which arrived in 1925, consisted of 2,750 eggs. A year later, the Australian stations had multiplied that to more than 2.5 million insects. Between 1926 and 1930, 3 billion eggs were released. The station at Chinchilla was sending about 14 million eggs a day. A handful of other species were also chosen for dispersal, including a species of cactus bug, the red spider mite, cochineal insects, and another cactus moth found in Texas. However, the other species failed to compete with Cactoblastis. Certainly, Dodd explains, no one could have visualized the outstanding devastation wrought by the moth. Between 1928 and 1939, the moths devastated the prickly pear population. Dodds reported that great areas were reduced to pulp quite suddenly. In a handful of months, regions that had been given up to the invader were virtually clear. Its progress has been spectacular, Dodd wrote in 1940. Its achievements border on the miraculous. A 1936 article in the Brisbane Courier-Mail dubbed the moth a wonder insect, under the headline, Reclaiming a Lost Province, 26 million acres torn from the death grip of the prickly pear. It was not entirely without setbacks. The initial destruction of prickly pear was so great and so fast that the moth ran out of food and its population cratered, only to rebound when new prickly pear growth replaced the old. The success was so great that a monument to the insect was built at Queensland, and a hall built that is called the Cactoblastis Memorial Hall, possibly the only public building dedicated to a bug. The moth had a devastating impact on the two most troublesome species, common and spiny pest pears. They were not the only species of interest, and the others were less impacted by the Cactoblastis moth. Tiger pear, for instance, was attacked with a species of Argentine cochineal insect. Tiger pear and others remained an issue. The New South Wales Prickly Pear Destruction Commission was only disbanded in 1987. While Queensland had the worst of the infestation, the moths were less effective in the cooler climates of New South Wales and also struggled to feed on some cactus that grew with lower nitrogen content, apparently vital to the moth larva. Efforts to contain non-native cacti in Australia are ongoing. The cactus was not entirely eradicated from Australia, and most of the species are still considered weeds of national significance. It's still generally illegal to sell or release them into the country. And the cactus has become a problem in other places as well. South Africa, Sri Lanka, the Caribbean. And while the release of the Cactoblastis in Australia is considered to be one of the most successful examples of biological control of an invasive species in history, its use has become problematic in other places. For example, when it was used in the Caribbean, it managed to cross over into the United States and Mexico, where now it threatens the prickly pear cactus in its native environment. But for Australians, however, the moth was truly a savior that saved much of the country from a potential cactus apocalypse. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.